Hi, this is Ken Jarecke, and we're talking again with photo legend David Burnett. We're going to pick up exactly where we left off from episode 11. So if you haven't watched it yet, check it out. David, how you doing?
Doing okay. Another day, another penaprism.
We started, we left off yesterday. We were talking about Contact Press Images, which was your agency you co-founded with Robert Pledge. We're both, Contact is still out there alive and kicking. We're both still contributing every week, every month, whatever, to their body of work. Can you paint me a picture of what physically the agency looked like at that point in time? You're on the Upper West Side, and just take it from there.
Well, we actually started in, I worked with Gamma, the French agency, from the summer of 1970 onwards for 2 years. His good friend, Raymond Depardon, who had been one of the original founders of Gamma when there was a split and a bunch of people went off to form Sigma. I started shooting for Gamma in New York, and he came from Paris to open the New York office of Gamma. And, a little apartment for one of those great deals. It was Somebody Knew Somebody, a like 10-room apartment. Keep ringing. Sorry. All right, hang on. Sorry. Hey, hon. Can I call you back? I'm doing an interview. Bye. We were both working for Gamma, and after a few months of Pledge being in New York, he got a friend of a friend knew about a great apartment in, and this is 1973 when New York was kind of going through a tough time. There was considered a rough time, more criminality, more of everything that made it kind of the funky old Gotham City view of New York. Anyway, this big apartment came open in Central Park West, and he took it and lived in one wing, and we created the agency in the other rooms that overlooked Central Park from the 10th floor. I mean, it was really a cool place. And we were there for, I don't know, 10 years, 15, I don't even know how long, but it was a long time. Moved from there down to sharing a space with Woodfin Camp on Madison and 48th, and then we moved down to 27th Street. It was like every place we went, as soon as we got there, it turned into a hot area. And like, people were streaming in, rents would go up. But we had a couple of big light boxes built. Pictures lived either in file cabinets, and there was this one special set of cabinets which were known as, which is where everything that was either extra good or published or both resided. And the safe was sort of the best of every photographer, even though there was no combination on it. We were never heavy. I mean, at one point, I purchased for the office this little machine that would dot matrix writing on slides, which prior to that, everything had to be either handwritten, or you would make these little sticky labels that never would go on straight. I mean, if you're trying to put a sticky label on a slide, 35 millimeter slide, it's a tiny, it was not easy to get it on there straight. But then somebody invented a little printer that would put slides. And that was like a technology boom, be able to actually get photographer and where and when it was shot and a little bit of caption information on a slide. Prior to that, it was there would be these sticky labels necessarily, but trying to envelop, we're kind of enveloped by this, the very modest technology of the 19th shooting, say we shot at least a roll of color, maybe colors for every black and white. Black and white, you knew that you had the negative and you'd always have the negative. With color, it was a little more dodgy because you had the question of, how many originals do you have if you want to cover a big event and you get in the stadium, you got one original for New York, one for the French agent, one for England, one for Germany, one for Italy, one for Argentina. Days was kind of a function of how we were trying to license and sell pictures, because you could take one good picture of the Pope and then have a bunch of really bad duplicates made. Or if you got him in a good position, you would just machine gun it and get 10 or 12 good pictures, and then the best ones would stay in New York and Paris, and the rest would go out. But at least that way, every agent had an original color of that situation. And in our case, we could be more than competitive that way.
So just to give a modern viewer an idea, because we're living in a time where, Doug Mills, he's almost transmitting, he's a photographer for the New York Times covering the White House mainly. He's almost transmitting his images in real time. And that's important and that's interesting. But just as a perspective, give me an idea of your workflow throughout a typical day. Say it's a Thursday, you're shooting on a Thursday and you're working for Time magazine.
Well, the one story I always try and go back to, because it's kind of the very basic of what the magazine world was like for so long, was working and like shooting a picture on Monday in Quezon and getting back to Quang Tri, which was the kind of the next big dropping off point. And you'd have people going back and forth from there to Saigon. Well, I didn't want to go all the way to Saigon to drop my film, so I'd look for a pigeon, or I'd look for somebody who could take my film, carry it back to Saigon. I'd call the office and say, so-and-so from the New York Times or whoever is bringing some film. They would get the envelope with all the film in it. And this was standardized caption envelopes. That only came out much later. I mean, it's amazing. That was like in the late 70s. Somebody said, why don't we pre-print some of these envelopes and we'll have a place to write captions? Because I think in so many cases, film would just come in and on a big 8x11 manila envelope, and it would just say, Cuba or something. I mean, it was not very well captioned. And in the end, the cap pretty important. So the Monday film would get, Monday day, they'd put it on the Pan American Round the World flight, Flight 1. And 30 hours later, Kennedy, which would be Wednesday morning. And this was the guy that I never met him, but existed, but the company was called V.T. Mancusi. And he was the cover at Kennedy that worked for Time Incorporated. All the men would have their messengers get the packet to a guy on a motorcycle, and the motorcycle guy would get on the road and get the film delivered to the building in Midtown Manhattan. That would be like Wednesday afternoon. So it's like 2 days and a half after you shot it. They'd open the envelope. There'd be the little thing saying Quezon, soldiers doing this or that. The color, if he would go into one lab, and the black and white would all get numbered with one of those little sticker number things. The film would go to the black and white lab. They'd process it overnight. They had these overnights so that they could get the film in the afternoon, run the film in the evening, and then make contact at night. And when you came into office, if you were one of the editors the next day, you would have these contact sheets. There were actual they cut the film, laid it on the paper, and and they were really good contact sheets. That was what a contact sheet was supposed to be about. Sidebar, when Jacques Lowe, the photographer who had spent so much time with John F. Kennedy, kept his negatives in like what was considered the safest place in the world, which was the World Trade Center. And when the buildings went down and everything there was ruined, everything, negatives were lost. But they had the original contact sheets where the film is actually on the paper. And from those contact sheets, they did the most beautiful book of pictures of Kennedy. I think it was done after he died. But those contact sheets were something. The ones that are done through the little plastic things, they're maybe a little better organized, but you can't do anything with them. They don't have that kind of sharpness and clarity. Anyway, in the whole story of this roll of film from Case on, so Thursday morning we would get the fact sheets, and I think the most interesting aspect of thing, depending on what part of the world the pictures were coming from, was that by then the picture editor and the writers in New York all had a better idea of what the story was. They weren't working for wire service where they had to just keep pounding the stories out every 5 minutes. They were looking to write something that would be in the magazine week. And it made no difference that they a chance to see what the pictures look like in the context of what they knew had been happening since those pictures were taken. I always thought that was a big deal, even though maybe not everybody else did. But so Thursday afternoon, they say, well, we're talking about so-and-so, that would be a good picture. Then Thursday night, they'd send the print order up. And Friday morning, they would get a bunch of prints from the ones that they liked. And then Friday afternoon, with the editor of the magazine, they'd look through everything and they would say, well, this story should be that picture. And then Friday night, they would take those prints and everything else out to Chicago to the printing plant and engrave the pictures. And the next Monday, the magazine was out, maybe Tuesday in Hong Kong. But it was as if you had this built-in time of reflection. Where everything now is so instantaneous. Anybody wants is what happened 5 minutes ago. And you're right, you refer to Doug Mills, who had a really great picture on Twitter or Instagram today of Air Force One sitting on the tarmac at Andrews after a heavy rain, and it's just wet, wet, wet. And it's a perfect reflection of Air Force One just sitting there. No president, no Trump, nothing, just the airplane. And, it's because he's always there. That's why he's getting these pictures. Sure, by now he's figured out a way to camera to his phone and from his phone to Twitter and to the New York Times feed. Pretty compatible with the wire services and everybody whose sole intent is speed.
So, but you kind of touch on the fact that maybe that's not always a great thing to be just out there immediately. There is this idea
something in the magazine world.
Yeah, I mean, you have to
reflect. In the magazine world,
you have to think about things, and you're in the magazine world. You're aiming to make pictures that would last not a few minutes or a few days, but those pictures wouldn't even be seen, like you said, till a week after they were shot at best.
was something to be said in the office about an hour ago. And of course, this is barbershops and doctors' magazines go to die. And there happened to be, I mean, it was kind of fun, a copy of 3 weeks ago's Time magazine with the race to the moon, and that was the Apollo issue, and I flipped it open, of course. I couldn't resist. And I showed the nurses that these are my pictures from 50 years ago. And there's still something about a printed copy, even, 50 years later. There is something about, to someone like me anyway, that you can hold it in your hand. It isn't just on a screen, and it doesn't have quite that same fleeting aspect that a screen image does. I'm a big fan of things in print, and I think it's harder and harder to justify it. The advertising money is the way that they're used. Big advertising pages to support editorial weekly and monthly magazines, and it's just terrible to see how it's kind of been a downward slope for 15 years. It's what is, it's what is. It's like you can't really do a heck of a lot. There is I think there's still a quality which print has that you don't get from looking at a screen.
Well, how much of your whole workflow was crafted by that end product of print? I mean, you're shooting slow film, you're duping in the camera, you're shooting images that are going to last, or you're really going out of your way to make lasting images. And I think one of the things we always talked about at Contact was this idea of, you started to make a picture that would last for a week, maybe a month, and then if it lasted a year, there was a good chance that it was a good picture. And we weren't base hitters; we were always swinging for the fences. And so, how does a photographer today get in that same mindset when everything is instantly, instant gratification, instant forgetting?
No, the thing is, you were always standing next to people who were trying to get something in print tonight or noon or maybe tomorrow. But I think it comes to frame pictures, to knowing that nobody was going to see these things for another, sometimes if it was a monthly, much longer than that. And you're in the back of your head, you can take a little bit more of a chance because, we've got the AP here, we have this or that other agency. I don't have to worry about that picture. I can try for something else. And I can't say that it worked all the time. There were plenty for something that maybe what you'd hoped for, but there were occasionally times when it paid off to be the last guy to leave the room, or you didn't have to rush out of the G7 summit to go get something processed right away. You could stick around and wait until it was just Medteron and coal and make a picture that nobody else was going to get. And sometimes it was the confluence of the subject was interesting enough, and you had enough patience to wait around for the picture. Was always the hard part.
Well, what's your advice to
not feeling?
So what do you say to the young photographer? Do you want them to slow down? Do you want them to be more introspective? How do they get, without having the pressure of having to produce something for print, how do they get to that level where they are being more introspective?
That's a really good question, because the lines have so blurred between the newspaper, what traditionally was known as the newspaper photographers, and the magazine photographers. I mean, for years, the magazine guys never expected to see their work in anything less than a week, and usually several weeks. And now that you have, this kind of the tearing down of the walls, you have newspaper people who are doing long form stories, and you have people, everybody is capable of turning a picture around in minutes, no matter what your supposed job is. So, what kind of advice is there? That's a really good question. I mean, I think we're kind of in uncharted territory. But the one thing that it does seem to me that hasn't changed all the way along are photographers who show enterprise in trying to react to a project or get on a project that they want to be on, not because somebody's sending them there, but because they think it's interesting. It's a worthwhile story that needs to be told and documented. And that, to me, ends up being the most interesting part of the whole equation. Is like, what can you do? What can you bring to the party that was not, that somebody else that has all the other, we've all got great camera gear. That's a given. Everybody's got great gear. So it's no longer, well, gee, if I only had that camera that shot 10 frames a second, or if I only had that 400 millimeter, there's no more excuse for, in the gear realm. I mean, I shoot with the new Sony cameras, but everybody is making great gear now, and it's a very personal choice. If you want to shoot with a Leica, if you want to shoot with the Panasonic or the Nikon's, Canons, or whatever, I mean, there's no hedge. Whatever you think is the best camera is the one that you should be working with, because that's going to be the one that you're going to feel is giving you the best deal. But there's great stuff out there, and then, when I was starting out, no matter what else you had, you wanted to have one Leica M4, usually with Tri-X, and everybody else was using Nikons for many years. I switched over to Canon in 1978, and I used the Canons for 40 years. I just moved over a year and a half ago to the Sonys, which feel to me like a little more modern, and they basically, every camera, what you want for it is to cut down all the crap that's in the way between what you're seeing there and what you're getting and being able to capture. So whatever camera that does that for you that's the one.
So now we can eliminate that middleman. There is a camera, there is a solution out there for you to capture on a sensor what you're seeing, exactly how you want to capture it, how you see it. So now, I mean, before, someone who had some technical chops could make a living in this game. Now do you have to, can an uninteresting person consistently make interesting pictures, or is it all about what the photographer brings to the table at this point?
There are going to be times when the picture, meaning something that happened in a place at a moment, is going to get grabbed by a school teacher or a pharmacist who happen to have their iPhone, just because there's that confluence of time and place. But in the world of more of what we're doing, which is storytelling, where you're essentially trying to find a story, or there's a story which you want to hone in on and target in on, and that will become your work. There's no question that at a certain point you have to invest in yourself. You have to believe in yourself. And I think even though we live in a very different time than 10 or 20, certainly 20 or 30 years ago in the magazine world, where you had that supporting infrastructure, you had editors with budgets who were able to support people that might just have an idea. And for many years, the most beloved editors were the ones that when you would throw an idea at them, they would just say, well, go try and do it. Let's see where it goes. I fear that those days are largely gone, and that the budgets have shrunk. The kind of money that used to be available is nothing like it once was. So now you have to be a little craftier in terms of how you're going to become a player. And um, probably now more than anything, it has to do with point of view. And rather than just being a great recorder of events, your pictures need to have some kind of a little personal twist or a little personal interpretation. And I'm not sure that's the easiest thing in the world to do. A lot of us, I mean, I've always tried to see myself as just someone who is not injecting myself into the situation. I didn't want to become friends with Ayatollah Khomeini. I just wanted to bop around and make pictures of him. And I wanted to do it in a like fair and honest way as possible. Now it's so much harder because the competition is big. I don't know what really the answer is. I mean, I think there's always going to be some kind of place or space for truth telling in photography and in storytelling. And in the end, this is, I think, what I think is my greatest desire to see is just that we can keep believing in photographs and in photography as a reasonable and fair and truthful way of telling stories. So much has been, we live in the world where so many things have been co-opted by all these forces of change and money and, the point of view of this magazine. Well, they'd never run a story because they're not like that. I mean, I can remember being in France in the early 70s and being amazed at the fact that you had Humanité, the communist paper, Libération, kind of the socialist paper. The François was the Gaullist paper. And all I remember these conversations I had with French photographers like, well, why can't there just be a paper that is the news? Why does everything have to, and then I look what's happened in American media in the last 20 years. That you've got, MSNBC on the left and Fox News on the right, and the place for just honest storytelling becomes much more challenging. I mean, it's certainly not CNN. I don't know. Those are the more obvious places in television, but it's hard to imagine that to try and see what's happened in journalism, the way so much of it has become so politicized and so much demanding that there is a point of view, but a heavy point of view. I mean, I'm sure if you work for MSNBC or Fox News, you're kind of told how you don't even have to be told because you know that that's where you work there. So you're just trying to cover it that way. And yet I've never, ever, I mean, maybe a time or two when I was photographing a war criminal and I thought, well, this guy doesn't really deserve much of a break. But generally speaking, I just wanted to take every assignment and every photo thing. I wanted to make a good picture. And this is what I could never understand about some subjects who was like so skittish. Like, we're not trying to make you look like a jerk. We're trying to make a good picture. I'm not trying to make you look like an idiot. I'm not trying to make you look awful. I'm looking for a good photograph that will, and whatever the article says, and usually, I can't think of that many times when the things that I was doing were so obviously pro or anti. I mean, I liked making a good picture. That was really it. I wanted a picture that would have a few extra seconds of life when somebody would be looking through a magazine and stop and look at it, 2, 3, 4 seconds. Yeah, and then the next page. If you've stopped somebody for 3 seconds or 5 seconds while they're looking through a magazine, that's like a huge victory in our business.
Well, it reminds me that you have your political opinions, and you kind of keep them to yourself, and you go out, and you've probably shot 500 people who are hoping to be president of the United States at some point. I probably shot a couple hundred. And the political positions, even if they sync up with you, doesn't mean you're going to sync up as a photographer. Sometimes the guys, the people you might vote for, you don't like them at all after you meet them. What's you? I mean, Dennis Kucinich is like the nicest guy in the world. It's just a pleasure to be around all the time, and you can't say that about so many politicians. I mean,
yeah. I remember that. No, and I made to cut you off, except I was doing an imitation of you. No, there were moments on these political campaigns where I was like, right now it's a little freaky with, I guess we're down to like 10 or 11 Democrats. It never really seemed, except well, and it is very early. We're 6 months away from New Hampshire. I mean, New Hampshire in January, right after Christmas, New Hampshire used to be a place. Now everything moved back like a whole year. You know, the year before the election year. It's not just go to New Hampshire in January and immerse yourself. By then, it's like almost over. You know, between the Iowa State Fair and the California Assembly and so forth. But nonetheless, I mean, I did a couple of things I mean, related to the political world back in 1984, when I think John Glenn was it 84?
Yeah, he's
Glenn
84.
Was yeah. So I'm doing a story on John Glenn for New York Magazine, and they sent me to Sacramento. The California State Democratic Convention was meeting at some big conference center auditorium. I forget what the name of it was. And I'm out there chasing him around, and he didn't have really great staff people, so it was not easy to kind of keep up with him unless all you did was like glue yourself to him, as a couple of people did. But it was early enough. It was like a year before. This must have been in early '83, maybe. And you had Dale Bumpers and Alan Cranston, and let's see, who else was looking around. I mean, I think '84, I think Mondale, but I don't think Mondale was at this event, so I'm wondering if I had the right year. Anyway, it was at this big convention center, and I had been trying to figure out what I was going to do to go for a cover. That was the thing you always wanted to. You got to get a cover, you know, got to get something that's going to be a cover. Well, right across the street from this place was this gigantic old-style camera store. And up front, they had all these beautiful camera cases. They had all the new reflex cameras and Leicas and Nikons and Canons and the big lenses and stuff out on a tripod that you could see what a 300-2.8 looks like. And in the back, they had a little studio section. And I looked around, I went in the back, and I plugged in one of the strobes that was set up, and I fired it. And right next to it was a sky blue seamless roll of paper. So I went up to the manager of the store, and I said, and you know, every now and then you got to sling it a little bit. And I went up and I said, listen, would you mind if the next president of the United States is photographed in your store? And of course, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm doing pictures of John Glenn, and I think he's going to go all the way. And I noticed you've got this little studio set up back there. I've got my meter. I metered it. It's f8. It's beautiful. It's ready to go. We could just walk him in from literally across the street. He said, yeah, sure, let's do it. Go ahead. So I ran and talked to Glenn's people, and I said, okay, about 5 o'clock, this thing's going to break up. I need to have you over here. So when I got over there, back to the cameras, one of the New York Times photographers, D. Gorton, I don't know if you ever knew Gorton. He was a Washington fixture for a few years for the New York Times. And Gorton was like, what are you doing, man? I said, hey, come on, this is going to be fun. And I've always, you know, it's like, okay, it would have been probably better to have have it to myself, maybe, but not necessarily. So I tell him what the whole deal is. He thinks it's like totally cool. And, hey, can I shoot a couple there? I say, yeah, no problem. Welcome to my studio. So I said, and he said, I'm going to go over and make sure the Glen people get here. And I said, okay, I'm going to keep the place clear because people are starting to kind of, float around here. And we just want to be able to get in and get our pictures. So he comes back 10 minutes later. He said, Glen's coming in 15 minutes. And I got Cranston and I got, I think, Ernest Hollings and Dale Bumpers. And Gary Hart. We ran everybody through this blue paper thing. And I'd shoot a couple. And I'd hand the sync cord over to Gorton, and he'd shoot a couple. I was like, thank you, Senator. And away they'd go. And then we had a little lineup that like 25 people are like watching this shoot go on in the back of this camera store. And 2 weeks later, I had the cover in New York Magazine of John Glenn in front of the blue backdrop paper. And it was, technically, it's one of the great pictures. Probably not that great, but it was okay. But technically has to include, were you able to get him into a place where you could shoot him? Because in the conference hall, it was like F1 at 1 second. I mean, there was no light, and it was crappy light. And here you had at least a chance to get, and we had everybody. I mean, somewhere I have all those pictures on blue, and I probably need to get them all scanned. That's the thing. I mean, now we've gone over to the world of electronics and scanning and stuff. And so many things have been scanned and so much hasn't been scanned yet. So it's
that's an enterprise. You found a situation, you took advantage of it, it paid off. There's people who would like to go out and tell a story, shoot a photo essay, and they're sitting at home and maybe they're searching on the internet. I know you received some good advice once about, and I think you still follow it today, about how to actually find a story to shoot.
Well, when I do these, I've done a few workshops in the last year, and I always remind the photographers that, first of all, the workshop, no one ever took a good picture in a workshop, so get that out of your head. The workshop is really about just trying to go to school and learn and be open to hearing things from people that you may be like me, who you don't even really know. But don't worry about making a picture this week. Worry about learning how to see. And I know you and I have talked about this, that photography is really about honing your ability to look and to see what you look at. And then the sort of the photographer thing kicks in about, well, I see it. Now, how can I translate that to a picture on a screen or a page? But I have always gone along with the idea that nobody lives that far away from a story. But you do not have to go to cover the recovery of baby elephants in Kenya. It would be fun. It would probably be really interesting. You don't have to go to Honduras to do a story on the death squads. You don't have to go to Philippines to do a story on political unrest. Wherever you live, pretty much guaranteed within a block or a 10-minute walk of whatever you call home, there's a story of human consequence, of human interest, that would be a great story for you to do. And it's the thing is, those are the stories that are the hardest. When you're starting to confront your own world and the world that you think you know, that ends up being the most difficult thing of all, because you're looking as much in a mirror as you are through a window. But there's no question that people, if you're a hermit and you live out in the middle of Death Valley, well, that might be a little tougher. But anybody else who is living in any kind of a social environment, there are stories everywhere you go. The bagel shop, your neighbor, back room at the laundry. I don't know. I mean, if you're looking for a place to just go practice the art of being a photographer, there are a million things available to you. And there's no way that you shouldn't, um, spend time uh, looking for things. If that's really what you want to do, if that's what you want to pursue, that's the thing to do. Just go hit it. I mean, there's a reason that there are a couple of things we're always saying. Get good shoes and zoom with your feet, because the stories seldom come to you. But if you go to the stories, you will find that there are things out there that are really interesting and visually challenging. And you don't really want the easiest picture. You want the best picture, and those are seldom the easiest.
But you're not gonna find these sitting on your couch or looking at your laptop.
No, that's for sure. You have to. There was this funny kind of back and forth on Facebook a couple of weeks ago about a camp where the kids have to leave all their phones at the office. You're not allowed over summer camp. No cell phones, no iPads, no nothing. And I think it's a great idea, not just for kids. I mean, grown-ups need this. We all need to be separated from this. This morning I went into the bagel shop. Sitting out in the car was somebody in the passenger side, like a parent in the passenger side, 2 kids in the back seat, and they were all just looking at their phones, just head on in their phones. I'm thinking, life really, I don't think they're all reading. I don't think they're all reading books on Kindle. That would be my guess, that they're reading some great classic. They're not reading Pearl Buck. I'm pretty much going to guarantee you that. But when we use these tools, they can be really great, but they can be real, narcotic style drug induced. Like, whoa, I can't see it because my phone has caused my eyes to no longer focus.
Well, how does that translate into? So you're out there, you're shooting pictures, but instead of actually engaging with the subject and learning to see and looking very closely, what happens when you start chimping, looking at the back of your camera?
Well, chimping has something. It's like we all have this desire to see how we did 5 seconds ago. And it's funny. I mean, I tell people at workshops or in like photo walks and stuff that, and usually I try and say it with the Arnold Schwarzenegger theatrical voice, which is, if you were a real man, you would put a piece of gaffer tape over your screen. Then, of course, nobody is tough enough to do that. Or you say, okay, you can take one picture and, look at your metering and stuff in the viewfinder and look at that picture. After that, you put a piece of tape over it, and you're not allowed for the rest of the day to look at your screen. That would just freak people out. I mean, it's like, well, why, if we have these tools? Well, it was like somebody I knew was once working as a photo assistant, and they were going through all the equipment with a photographer, and he said, well, how does the light meter work? And they said, no, you're not going to use a light meter. You, first of all, have to learn what light is just by looking at it. Once you've done that, then you can use the meter. But you're not allowed to use the meter until you can just look at a scene and say 125 at 5.6 or whatever it is. But he wanted that assistant to be able to see without having to resort to some kind of wacky device like a light meter. And once you start to become so comfortable with it, I mean, for years, and I haven't shot Kodachrome now for 10 or 15 years, I have lost my ability to look with my Kodachrome eye. I can just look out and say, yeah, 60 at 5.6. And I would be within a half stop. So I might bracket a little bit just to make sure I had one. But I could, I liked having that light meter to tell me, but I think I knew by the thousands and thousands of Kodachrome exposures I made what the light was going to be. And
So
I don't think
does
there's,
it start with light for you, or what gets your motor running when you pick up that camera, you walk out the front door? I mean, is it a personality? Is it a moment?
no, it's definitely, I think it's the light first, and then it's like what's happening in there, and then where can I be to make what's happening in there more interesting, uh, and where can I take advantage the greatest way of that light. That's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to distill down the way that light is hitting. You know, photography, it's writing with light, and light is your medium, and you have to. I'm just trying to think of the last week where I was shooting a couple of things out in Oregon. The first thing that hits me is that, you know, sort of they all fall together a little bit. The compositional aspects, what might work and what won't work, and how the light is hitting something. And then, do I want to change it, or do I want to inadvertently change it, or do I want to just go with what's there? I try usually and just go with what's there. That doesn't always work, but um, the interesting thing is just analyzing the way the light is hitting something or someone, and not shooting right away, but then forcing yourself to kind of keep looking. Well, how could it be better? You know, I had a friend that used to say about every picture he ever showed me that got published, he would always say, I had a better frame. You know, it's like we all had one. I mean, it's
Join the club.
so seldom that the best picture ever got used, but it was the quest for that best picture is kind of what made it interesting. And you're right about that. I mean, wanting to always just kind of keep upping it, and when it looks good, hey, that's great, but let's make it look better, or just keep going, keep going.
But I mean, to come full circle, isn't that what the print medium, isn't that what not being able to immediately review what you were shooting, it forced you, because you never knew what you had and you never knew how far you could take it, and so you worked it to death. And now I see people will chimp and they'll move along, they're done, I got it.
Right, right. You know, it's I think there definitely are these moments when the sense of adventure is quelled by when you're satisfied with something that you shot. And I'm not saying you should never, like you're saying, I don't think you should like never be satisfied. I mean, occasionally when there's some little something happens and the water droplets are all perfectly aligned or whatever, and you know you got the picture, that's great. But it doesn't happen that often, and I don't know how people who are so completely into chimping and it's just like shoot and look and shoot and look. I mean, it definitely gives you a little bit of an advantage in the immediate moment, but I'm not sure that over time it makes you a better photographer. I think you're always sort of worried about competing with yourself rather than just going out and doing the best you can.
What about sharing the back of your camera with a subject? I mean, I can't imagine doing, say, like a formal portrait of Gorbachev like you did, with a little window
I
light.
would never have wanted to show him anything that I shot. No, I mean later maybe, and not even the portrait so much as the picture of him at his desk, because as I understood it, that no one had ever really been in his private office before, which is where I had this interview. And at the end of the interview, he went with his assistant over to the desk about 20 feet away. And I had all my cameras spread out on a sofa, and I was trying to make it look like I was packing up, but I was just moving stuff around and take a lens off and put another lens on, and then move that over here, and I pick the other camera up and put that lens, make sure I film, and I checked the light, and I knew it was like 125 at 2. And we got to his desk, I just turned around and went bada, 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 bada. 5 or 6 frames, and then he kind of looked up, and I had a picture, and then I actually packed up. But it was a little, I mean, you look at it, it's not a great picture, but it's Gorbachev in his private office. That was not something that most people ever got to see.
Well, that's a great, you bring up a great, old photographer's technique. I don't know if it was Gene Smith or Gene Smith used to do it. Gary Winogrand used to, the befuddled photographer. Oh, I'm just kind of not, sure what I'm doing here.
I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm just trying to pack up, but I don't know where I left my 50. I got to take it on and off my camera 3 or 4 times. Yeah, I mean, it's still, the more you can look like a doofus and the less you can look like an incisive, I'm really going to make a picture of you that you're not going to believe, the more you can sort of tone down a situation and get it to a point where people either don't notice you or they're only noticing you in a way that you might wish they would.
So that brings me up to a story I told on the last episode about I was assisting you. I was a young guy, and you had 5 minutes with Lee Iacocca, which kind of brings all those techniques into play.
Well, I think you probably remember it better than I do. I was probably just wondering how fast is the clock ticking, and can I get, and we've had him at that long table, right? It was the big long.
We were in a conference room, and it was a long table, and you had stayed at lunch too long with Arnold, and
yes.
We both had our Robert Pledge contact press image issued leather jackets on, and we ran 8 blocks down to the Pan Am building. Your glasses were fogged up. We had a white lightning, and you went into this room, and
I believe it was the old white lightning. It was one that looked like a saucepan that you would cook soup in.
Yeah, it looked like a coffee can. It was a coffee can on a stick.
Mm-hmm. And it was just like, the thing about the white lightning was it kind of had this big built-in reflector. You could just put it in a little room and it would give you F8. And then after that, it was up to you. And it's true when you're shooting something and there's no Polaroid and there's no instant anything. You're just like, the fanciest you get is to like punch your light meter up and see that it's F8 or something. And then hope that you can just keep the guy on the line and keep him from walking out. And, some of these guys, he was pretty good, I think. I mean, he wasn't really that into it, but he didn't like say, okay, you got your 2 seconds. I mean,
well, no, the deal was you were going to get 5 minutes, but that might be 3 minutes. And you told a story.
5 minutes always sounds pretty good. What?
Well, you told a story. You're telling Lee Iacocca, you have him positioned at the end of the table, and you're telling him a story about you being an aviation nut when you were a kid, and this conference table would have been the perfect aircraft carrier to land your paper planes. And he wasn't impressed, but the takeaway, it was another take on the befuddled photographer, and you kind of get their sympathy. You kind of get an extra 2 minutes if you're lucky.
You're always trying to be a little sympathetic and leaven that with, with the, you don't want to be the sorrowful slob, but you're just trying to like keep the chatter going while you're going from a 50 to an 85, because all of a sudden you think it needs to be a little tighter. I mean, it's true. Those kind of things would weed out the men from the boys. You would, and sometimes you get something. I had once. I was doing traveling with some very senior Time magazine people. We were in Bonn, Germany, with Helmut Schmidt was then the chancellor, and I was supposed to get in for the interview. It was like the 3 top dogs, two top dogs from New York, and the bureau chief from Bonn, and they were having an interview with him, and they didn't let me in. And I had said to the what I had said to the bureau chief was, make sure I get invited in at the end here so I have some pictures. And of course, he walks out at the end of the thing, has not said anything about a photographer. And I kind of gave him like, well, you know, what's going on? And he just kind of like shrugged his shoulders like, well, too bad, I'm not the photographer. And I walked in and I just said, Mr. Bundeskanzler, I'm the photographer. I know you've got to get back to work and everything, but would you mind if I just stuck around for a few minutes and made a few shots of you at work? And he took his pipe and he lit it up. And he said, yeah, go ahead. And I stayed in for like 10 minutes. It was way more interesting than what I would have had during the interview. And then finally, after about 10 or 15 minutes, he just said, well, okay, I think we've done this. And you know, shook hands, goodbye, and that was it. But it was a total wipeout that got saved by trying to be the nice guy as far as the talent was concerned. But I just didn't want to say no. I didn't want to just admit that I had no pictures. This was, you know, my people in New York were going to say, they didn't care that I got no help from the Bond bureau chief. And, no, it was the cool thing about it was that the bureau chief after this realized that I'd had better access than he did.
Right.
And that was really all I cared about.
Sure. No. And so, you know, one of my theories is you can never worry about, I mean, unless you're a French agency photographer, you can never worry about looking cool when you're making pictures. The most you can hope for is you don't go full plumber in front of a auditorium full of people. You know,
Really.
you're in the buffer zone and you go full plumber. You don't want to, you don't want to do that.
Oh my God, the buffer zone, and hand me that wrench. Yeah.
Tell me about Onward. Speaking of politicians.
I had a situation like that though about 2 years ago when Rex Tillerson was being confirmed for Secretary of State. And, you know, it's one of those Senate rooms with the big round desk thing upon which the dais where all the senators are. And then on this gigantic, like 14-foot long table, just Tillerson. No counsel, no anybody, just him. And I thought, God, if I could kind of get in close to him and behind the table and below, I could kind of do an upshot. Let's see if that worked. My knees had already started to go by then. Kneeling has been very hard, but I'm kind of crouched over in the corner. And the thing is, like the Dennis Brack camera bag, the heavy plastic one that you can actually sit on, it only gets your butt about a foot off the floor, but that foot is like the difference of a lifetime. It's really, it was the only way to go. But I didn't have anything like that on this deal. And I sort of like, finally I figured, okay, let's go. When he's looking over at the Democratic side, that'll be the time. So I go over to the edge of the table, and I'm kind of on one knee, and I'm down, and I've got my camera with a little flip-up screen, and so I can hold it down like a Rolleiflex and get the line of the table, and it kind of, all these lines meet right where he is. And I shoot a few, and he's kind of going, you know, it's a very quiet room. Everything gets noticed in these big quiet rooms. And he's doing, well, Senator, if I did so-and-so and so-and-so, and here's what I believe about that. And I'm thinking, I can't get up. My knee is not working. And so I'm kind of in party to all this conversation, but all I'm really doing is trying to figure out how in the heck do I get out of here? And finally, at one point, I said, well, this table is big enough that if I lean on it, it's probably not going to move. It's got to weigh a ton. So I kind of put one arm up on it, and I do 1, 2, 3, and I kind of hop a little bit, and I'm like, yeah, and I managed to get up into a standing position, and I just walked back over by the stenographer where I collapsed, and that's all I needed. You know, I got my picture, and I got out of there with both knees intact. But it's a business where you need knee pads. Most people don't consider a knee pad as important as a monopod, but it's right up there.
Yeah, the Dennis Brack, that's the hard cased camera bag. He's been making a living off of that.
Stand on it.
You know.
I used one of these little hunter's cases for a while. Hard plastic with a little round, semi-round top, and you could keep a 300-2.8 in there. And when you get somewhere, you just sit on it, and your legs are saved. It really made a difference.
So you spent 44 days in Iran, and you did a book, and it's when the Ayatollah came back into power. And it's an amazing book to me, because there's something, if you look at the book, and I've looked at obviously the original takes, and I've gone through your folders and everything. I didn't know if you knew that or not, but I have. But when you look at that, you look at the contact sheets, you look at the images, and you look at the book, you can see what you're doing over that 44-day period is you're building an essay up from the ground up. And each day, I describe it as you're adding another brick to that building, that essay you're building. Can you tell me how that went? And
well, here's the thing about Iran. I mean, I'd done a 2-week assignment in Pakistan, and then as now, who wants to fly halfway around the world, shoot something, and then just come right back? Well, you're somewhere else. Like, go take advantage of it. Go do something with the fact that you're there. And so I got back to Karachi on Christmas Day and was like trying to figure out, well, do I go to India, or do I go to Indonesia, or back to Vietnam? But I'd heard over the previous couple of months in these little news dispatches that there had been some big demonstrations against the Shah. And I figured, well, maybe I should just go to Iran for a few days and see what's doing. And all the big stories.
Let me just interject. You're not looking at the internet. You're looking at like the International Herald Tribune. You're listening to the BBC every
Mostly
night.
you're listening to the BBC. That was in a way that no one can really ever understand now. Shortwave radio was the one link you had to the outside world. It was the one thing, and Jean-Pierre Lafont would always keep this running set of recommendations about what, the ICF 7600 was this big, and then it was the 4300, and they kept, and Jean-Pierre was always like, you have to have the best radio that takes the least amount of space. And I still have a couple of those radios. They were great radios, and you can't really, in the States, you can't get very much on them, but almost anywhere you travel in Europe and Asia, you can still pick up those shortwave signals. And that was the one way. I mean, there in Iran, once I was in Iran, more than once, I found out something that was going on in the city, 2 blocks from my hotel, on the radio that I never would have otherwise found out about. But BBC World Service was great in those days. And, so many of these things just became like bowled over or clobbered by all the new crap that we have. I mean, everybody's looking at their phone 24/7. Are people really any better informed? I don't think so. I mean, we goof off with all these things. Everybody says, oh, all I do is read the news. Well, yeah, maybe. But, the level of way that we were informed in those days was largely reliant on what you could get out of either an international newspaper or your shortwave radio. And the rest of it, I mean, there were no phone calls. You couldn't really phone around anybody. When I was those couple of months I was in Iran, I can still remember on these dial phones, that was just to get an outside line. And then you have to hang up. There were a couple of times when you go down to the Telephonist's office. That was a great word that doesn't really exist much anymore. And buy him well, not a beer, but like take him a cold Coke or something and just say, hey, I got a train call New York in a little while. Can you help me out on that? And they would dial the number in for you. But it was, everything got out that way. There was no laptoping. Laptop? Are you kidding me? This was years before the first laptop. And there was just something really kind of cool about the fact that it all had to go in a very um, analog way. I hate that word, but I mean everything we did was like film and phone calls, and occasionally somebody would come running into the hotel and saying something was going on, and you'd go get in a car. And but even in a way, in the 2 months that I was in Iran, even getting around was symbolic of the way we covered the story, because the only people that had the money for hired cars from the hotel were the TV networks. The rest of it, see, you try and bum a ride with somebody. But then the one time that I actually rented a car, and this happened all the time, was like you go somewhere in the car and you tell the guy to wait, and you get involved in a march, and you march for 2 hours, and you'd be 4 miles away from where your car was. So you're paying for something you can't use. It just it didn't make any sense. So we would learn, the first word we learned in Farsi was mustarim, and you'd stand on the side of the road and yell out mustarim, meaning more or less straight ahead, like I'm just going that way. And if people saw you with all your cameras, and they think, oh, there's an interesting guy, let's pick him up. And people were always very hospitable, and they give you a ride, and they just kind of say, okay, stop, and the car would pull over, and you get out, and you get on the crossroad, and then you get another mustarim going that way. That's how we would get around. I mean, it was incredibly, GPS. Yeah, that hadn't been invented yet. Um, it was a story that was happening every day, but you never knew where or when. And things would happen that you would just have to try and go to the 4 or 5 usual places where stuff happened. Sometimes nothing, and sometimes, you know, heavy duty stuff would go down, and you just had to take a chance on it. Being a photographer and being a journalist, just like, well, I got to try and go where the action is, even though I don't know where that is.
Well,
And things,
I kind of liken it to the difference between going to a strange city and using MapQuest or whatever's in your rental car to get around, as opposed to just using a paper map. When you use the
right,
paper map, you actually learn the city and you figure out. You use MapQuest, you never know where you are or where you've been.
right. Oh, totally. No, and I was somewhere last couple of weeks ago, and I had a map, and I'm like, okay, that neighborhood is up here, this one is over here, and I thought I was. This happened to me once in London, and this sort of ruthless cab driver. I got in a cab a block from where I wanted to go, but I didn't know I was that close, and I was trying to go to the Time office in London. Actually, I said, going whatever, 140 New Bond Street. Well, you know where that is, right? And of course, the guy is just chuckling because he knew where it was and I didn't. Like it was a block away, and you like drove around the block 4 times and charged me a couple of pounds for it. And this actually happened to me um, recently, where I thought I was someplace that I needed to get a car, and I got an Uber, and the guy basically drove around the block and dropped me off like 200 feet from where I got in. And it was like my fault, not his. I mean, I guess he could have said, well, why don't you just walk it? You'll be there in a minute. But, sometimes there was just something great about not knowing where you were and jumping in and letting the story wrap itself around you. I did that. Iran, I think there was a lot of that. There were a few pretty well-known areas. There was Esfand Square and the Shah Yad, which was this big monument to the Shah's father. And everything of course, had a name change in these last 40 years. But it was it was a place that you could just know that something was going to happen in the afternoon, and you didn't know what, but that's why you had to go show up. And I don't know, it was a real learning experience for me, just like investing in your own judgment about deciding where to go and where to be.
Well, that's the journalistic side of it, and this idea that you immerse yourself into a place, and then you kind of just feel the pulse, and you can kind of sense and feel where things are going to happen, and you don't really have to get a Twitter feed to figure that out, which I think is kind of a lost talent. But it's kind of, we're always the Marilyn Monroe. We're always depending on the kindness of strangers, and
Sure.
so tell me how you got in the room. That's the other thing a
Well,
photojournalist
that
has to
was
have a place to. You got to get in the room. You have to have a place to stand. So how'd you do that?
so after the return of Ayatollah Khomeini, he'd been in exile for years in Iraq and then more recently in France. And for that reason, the French were kind of considered friends during this unstable period. But because Khomeini was in France, that kind of gave the French photographers a little running room. When you're an American and you're surrounded by people yelling "Death to America," it gets your attention. I mean, I didn't ever really feel like I was in any real danger, although I got stopped by the army a couple of times. But amongst the crowds, I don't think I ever felt anything other than a very hospitable group of folks. And after he got back, and he settled in this little school. It was a school in the city, and it had a big playground, like a 2-story brick building, kind of wings all the way, all around, and then this very big area that was like a playground, in which the windows from this one little room that he would go and sort of spend the day in, the window looked out into the crowd, and so they'd bring in 4,000 or 5,000 people at a time, either all women or all men, never together. And it would take him a while to fill the place up, and then he would come to the window and wave, and people would just get crazy and scream and yell and very very supportive. They all wanted to see him, and they wanted to touch him. They wanted to hear him. He would usually just stay at the window for a minute and wave, and that was it. So each time that he did that from the outside, if we were outside and I covered these for a couple of days, I was up high looking down into the crowd. I was in the crowd. I was close to the window. I was backed off from the window. Every time some new group would come in, you'd try and figure out a different place to try and shoot it. But they had named or they had asked an economics professor to be the liaison with the international press. The guy didn't really know what he was supposed to do, but he kind of took the job on. And, the press would come like to an 11 o'clock briefing. We're having a briefing at 11, and we'd get there, and he would have nothing to say. He didn't really understand. It was kind of like the Trump White House. There was a briefing, but there was no briefing at the briefing. And after a couple of days, the TV people just stopped coming. And that was kind of when I got into it. And I would just say to him, I was trying to explain to him, I said, look, we've made great pictures of Imam from out in the crowd, but there's a very good picture to do from inside. And I would just like to be the one that made that picture. And so he would just say, well, okay, thank you. And, come back tomorrow. And I'd come back tomorrow and I'd give him my pitch again. And fewer and fewer people were showing up each day at the so-called briefing. And about the 4th or 5th day, and I think it probably just had something to do with my loyalty of attendance, that I just kept coming back. And that was the first time that instead of saying, come back tomorrow, he just said, please wait. And at that moment, he went out and kind of checked. It was like, hey, is it okay? I've got this photographer. seems to be okay. And I don't know what he said or who he said it, but when he came back, he said, "Follow me, please come with me." And we went into this this warren, this sort of basement warren of hallways, and all, you know, walking down this way and that way and this way. And all of a sudden we get to this doorway, and he says, "Can you please remove your shoes?" I was still wearing my old Vietnam combat boots, these big high lace combat boots, which normally were like 5 minutes to get on and off. And I had them off in about 10 seconds. They flew off my feet. And then this was the other thing you always had to do in the film era, was flip up the little rewind lever and make sure that when you wound it, that there was resistance, and proving that you had film in the camera. Because we all have taken great pictures on the pressure plate of the back of the camera. And it's a picture that you just will probably never get around to sell. Just not a great picture. But I checked everything. I said, okay, and they opened the door, and I took 2 steps in, and I just grabbed one camera and made a shot of him as he was putting his little teacup back on the dish. And so many interesting players are in that one picture, because you have Khomeini. The guy who's kneeling down to get the teacup is Kotali, who later became known as the hanging judge of Tehran, who took over some of the courts and just was literally hanging people right and left. He was pretty ruthless. And then there were a couple of other imams who were considered important in the revolution. I think everybody is dead now that was in that picture, except possibly one guy who's in the window. He's outside kind of doing crowd control, and he's turned around looking in through the window at me. And I suspect if I ever do get back to Tehran, he's the guy who I'd like to try and meet up with 40 years later.
So tell me more.
I made my pictures. Well, just to finish the story. So I kind of make my first pictures as I walk in, and then I did the thing that I always try and do, which is to disappear. I went to the opposite corner of where he was sitting, and I just put my back in it and let my knees fold, and I just slid down into the corner. And then a few minutes later, some other religious came in black robes, and I had a moment to get a picture of him between the black robes, and that was a picture. And then he went up and got on his feet and went to the window, and I went up to shoot with a 20, too wide, but just shooting something of him waving at the crowd, but now from his point of view instead of all those days I had done before out in the crowd. So it was great. And then he walked away to go to prayers, and that was it. I just rewound all that film, stuffed it in my pants pocket, and it was one of those rolls of film that you write exclusive on in a big letter on your caption envelope.
So I've seen the contact sheet, the black and white. I assume you're shooting that with a Leica. I'm not, maybe not, but you got your cover out of the deal. You made sure to get a color.
Actually, I did not get a cover. No.
No?
I was with a French guy named Renaud Walter, who, he had been involved in Iran before, and he came back on the plane, and he was a friend of Pledge's, and he nothing terrible. I mean, he wasn't a great photographer, but he was a guy with a camera. He, I think, actually had, if I'm not mistaken, he had a cover. I never got a cover. I got a lot of inside pictures of Khomeini, although everybody thinks I had the cover, but I don't think. I think he was Man of the Year at Time magazine, but I think that was a painting. But I had pictures. I had plenty of good pictures, and a lot of them got used. But I don't think I ever had a Time cover. I had a couple other covers.
No, but you did. You shot your color images along with the black and white with a longer lens.
Mm-hmm. There's a few wide shots. There was one shot of Khomeini laughing, which, I mean, how many times have you seen that picture? Like, not many. He's like it's as if somebody's told a really good joke. And, he was always pretty serious looking. but that, some of that was probably a Canon with a 28 with Kodachrome. But I have a few, and then I did some tight shots, and then there's a couple of really, very sinister kind of face, uh, tight 200 millimeter shots where he's looking real intense. Just, shoot them as you can do them. That's all it is. I mean, get the opportunities and then don't miss it.
No, absolutely. I remember that. Just an amazing take. Amazing. What were you in there? 10 minutes, maybe?
Yeah, maybe 20 or half an hour. At one point, he went outside and then came back, and I had moved my fishing bag, my Hardy fishing bag, and he almost tripped on it. I have a picture of him walking back in. It looks like he's going to hit my camera bag, which that would have been a really bad moment.
That would have been awkward.
It would have been awkward if he tripped on my camera bag. But I have this shot of him with the camera bag that I kind of love. And then he was there another few minutes and then gone, and that was it. And how much do you need?
Right.
When everybody else has zero and you have something, that really makes it more interesting.
But just tell me, we'll wrap up here. I know, we're going a long time, but there's something between, it was exclusive. You had the exclusive, but also you didn't just rely on the fact that you were the only photographer to get in the room besides the French guy. You still made pictures that could stand the test of time, even if they weren't exclusive.
No, but that's the thing. When you have a chance to make a picture, you make a little more of an effort. Like I had a situation like this at the funeral of Juan Perón, and I'd been covering. I mean, it's like a long story, but it involves a really wonderful, another French photographer, a great guy named Alain Nogues. So all during the French presidential campaign, I was in with Gamma, and we had worked a deal out where I was kind of the official campaign photographer. And I got to fly on the plane with the candidate pretty much every trip he did around France. Alain Nogues, who was this great photographer working for Sigma, had to get up every morning that there was an event like this, and he'd get up crack of dawn and drive in his Peugeot to wherever the thing was. He'd have a 3 or 4 hour drive to get there. We'd shoot pictures, and I, of course, would be shooting pictures backstage, and he'd be getting stuff out front. So he got to really have as we used to say in the Army, a case of the ass about me. He really did not appreciate, especially I think that an American was shooting all this inside stuff, and he was kind of pissed off about it. I never have once blamed him for feeling that way. I'm sure I would have felt the same way. And I was getting pretty good stuff, and he was getting good stuff, but I was not having to work for it as hard as he was. So along the way, there were a couple of times, and I had actually gone out of my way to tell him how good a set of pictures that he'd done a year before in the North African drought. I thought I'd seen them in Perry Match, and I thought they were really, really worthy of the space they got. So we finish up, we do the election. I kind of head back to New York, and like maybe 10 days later, Juan Perón dies in office in Argentina, and there's a big state funeral. So I figure, well, I got to go. I fly down. I get to Buenos Aires. Nobody at the airport. You had to take your own baggage off the 707. It was that kind of a deal. Oh, sorry. So yeah, you had to take your own baggage off the plane because everybody was downtown, gathered around the Congress building where Perón was lying in state. I get downtown, I go to the Time Magazine office, and they have arranged for me to get an official credential. So I put the credential on, leave my suitcase there, and I take the camera bag, and I start walking like the last mile down Corrientes to the place where there's like 500,000 people gathered around the Congress building. And I'm looking for a little elevation because it's getting to be late in the afternoon, and I see that people are starting, it's so packed that people are collapsing and fainting and being passed over hand by hand to get them out of the crowd. So I see a TV truck, and I go and I climb the stairs of the TV truck, and it's filled with cameramen and photographers, but I see one little space, and I walk over there, put my bag down, and I just lay my legs out, and I sit down, and it's right next to Alan Nogues. He said, "Well, Dave, where you been?" And I said, "Well, I just got in," and he'd been there maybe an hour, having flown in from Paris. And there are these amazing scenes of people collapsing and very emotional scenes outside. And finally, it's getting to be dark. I said, "I think it's time to go inside." And he said, yeah, let's go. So we pick up our stuff, and we get down from the truck, and we walk around to the big door of the Congress building. And it looks like the Capitol in Washington. It's got the big dome. And knock on this big door, and the door opens. And this guy says, "What do you want?" He says, "Well, we're periodista, we're photographers." And we said, "Okay, come on in." And we start to go in, and he puts his hand out and holds Nogues' shoulder, and he says, "You don't have the right credential." And I said, "This is my assistant. He has to come with me." "Well, okay." And so we go in, and all of a sudden, Alain is like, "Hey, Dave, you didn't have to do that, really." I said, "Oh, listen, man, I never want to beat anybody by leaving them at the door. And in my head, I'm thinking, I just want to get a better picture. That's all. That's how I really want to beat you." So we get in, and the body is lying in state, and it's flat in this open coffin. And we are from where the photographer's little perch is. They put up several rows for photographers. You're looking right into the sole of his shoes and the cotton that's in his nose, because he's lying down, and we're kind of right at body level. We shoot for a while, and I see that we're in the dome of the Congress building, and I'm thinking, I remember Bob Gomel's picture of Dwight Eisenhower, and I think I remembered, whether or not it actually existed, a picture at St. Paul's of Churchill's burial. And after like half an hour of shooting, and we kind of get in line, we walk through the mourners, we'll shoot with like a one-handed grab shot as we walk by the coffin, and they throw us back in the photo area. And it was like, now I've been up for like hours, into my second day, and I go to the little press cafe, and I have a shot of Argentine coffee to try and wake up. And there's a photographer standing there, and I said, "Say, let me ask you something. Do you know who's in charge of the building here? Who would be in charge of the dome?" And he says, "I don't know. It's a good question." And he asked the coffee barista. He asked him, and the guy says, "Oh, it's the president of the Senate." I said, "Okay, well, let's go talk to the president of the Senate." So now I have this local sort of 40-year-old guy whose card says weddings, baptisms, bar mitzvahs. And we're walking down the hallway, and I'm kind of looking around to see what else is around. And there's another one of these giant interior doors now, but it's one of these big wooden doors. We knock on it, and the door opens. "What do you want?" So, "Well, we want to talk to the president of the Senate." "Oh, he's in a meeting. You got to come back." So we go, we sit down for 10 minutes. We go and we knock on the door again. "What do you want?" "Well, we still need to talk to the president of the Senate." "Well, he's not here." And meanwhile, I'm looking down the whole hallway, all the way the length of the building, looking to see if Nogues is making a move the way I am. And at one point, I see him seeing me and dodging behind a pillar. And it's become like spy versus spy. So like the third or fourth time, we were pretty patient. We go up and we knock on the door. And now instead of this old codger opening the door, there's also a young guy. And I kind of spring into action. And I said, "Estamos periodista de Nueva York, fotógrafo de Time Magazine, de la revista Time. Y tú sabes que por todos los grandes funerales de todos los líderes impresionantes del mundo. President Kennedy, Primer Ministro Churchill, Presidente de Gaulle. Hay siempre un foto hecho de alto por mostrar el majístico. I mean, I am making this stuff up as I go, because Spanish was not one of my languages. But I'm just kind of throwing this shit at him. And the guy is like, wow, Kennedy, Churchill, that's a great idea. And I said, I'd like to do a picture from up top there. And the guy said, and so this guy then decides he's going to take me and the bar mitzvah photographer, and we're going to go try and find our way into the dome. So we start walking upstairs, and I think immediately that's a good sign to be going upstairs. And we turn a couple of corners, and he's kind of like, voila. And we're looking now into the room, which is not the room with the coffin, but it's the antechamber where all the VIPs are waiting to then go out through a door and into the big deal, and to the big domed room. And I said, well, here's the thing. We actually have to be in the same room as he is. Like, you think we could get, he said, well, I never promised you the third floor. I only promised you the second floor. I said, you did a great job, but let's just see if we can do it. So we go walking out from there, and there is one of those sergeants with a leather strap on his patent leather hat that kind of separates 5 folds of his chin. You know, this guy is like serious bad guy, badass. And my friend, now he's our new friend, he says, explains that the photographers need to get up to the top to take a picture. And the sergeant's like, well, there can't be any flash. And I'm like, no, ningún flash, nada flash. And I fired the cameras, you know, muy silencio, mi con, muy silencio. And I'm firing a couple of things, and he's like, well, okay, but be quick about it. And we start to walk up this curly Q staircase. And now I'm thinking, I better make sure I have film in the camera. Had a roll of high-speed Ektachrome, one camera with the 105 and the 180. I had Tri-X, and I had maybe a 28 to do a wide shot, which was probably going to be too wide, but I didn't know how high we were going. And this thing goes all the way to the top. And now I get up there, and there's the chest-high marble, like a ring of a fence. And I grab my camera, and I figured, 125 at 3.5, and I look over the edge, and I just see Juan Perón looking at me. It was like a moment I will never forget. And I shot about 8 frames, and then I took the 35 and I shot a little wider one, and then I tried to switch lenses, and I think by the time I was just switching lenses, this giant claw from the sergeant appeared on my arm and just grabbed me and like, bastante, enough, you got it. So I start rewinding. As we're walking down the stairs, I start rewinding the film, and I say to the bar mitzvah photographer, okay, this is our little secret, right? And he's like, oh yeah, no secreto, no problem. So I go back, have another coffee, and then this is like, by now I've been gone for like 40 minutes. I go back to the photo area, and there's Alain. And he says, what up? I said, oh man, I just needed that coffee. I'm finally starting to wake up a little bit. And I said, well, I tried to see about the dome, but it's forbidden. I said, yeah, they're being really tough about it. And I didn't say anything else. Went back to, then shortly thereafter, went back to the Time office, wrote exclusive all over an envelope about 10 times and put the film in it. I think that was like a Tuesday, so the film would have got there like on a Wednesday. And when we got the play report on Friday, opening with Burnett full-page color of Perón casket. And at that point, I saw Alain over the weekend, and he said, so Dave, tell me, did you get up there? I said, I can't tell a lie. I did get up there, yes. And then on Monday, it was out, and every news vendor in Buenos Aires had Time magazine, like 6 of them, open to that page and with clothespins pinned up to the side of their newsstand. And unfortunately, I didn't even take a picture of that, which would have been an even cooler picture to have. But it was just one of those cases where trying to go that extra mile actually work. And the fact that I had managed to get Alan into the building without a credential, I felt like honored by that I'd been able to do it and still beat him. That's how I wanted to beat him, you know.
Nice, nice. So one of the main traits, I guess, is curiosity for a photojournalist.
True.
And persistence.
Persistence, but you kind of need both. I mean, if you have curiosity, that's what kind of gets you going, but you need to be persistent. The people, and it's like I tell my daughter, who's a young actress, I said, there are millions of people who gave up, and those are not the people you see. And you know, if you're a not giver upper, you might make it, but what's sure is that if you give up, you for sure won't make it. And photography is the same thing. It's easy to find other things to do or other excuses, but if you're driven by your curiosity and your desire to see the world, it can be pretty fun.
Yeah, it's an e-ticket, to reference something that nobody knows what it means, but
right.
Thank you, David. I want to I usually recommend a book. I'm going to recommend this one. This is for the photojournalist. This is for the history buff, but it's also for the photojournalist who wants to learn how to piece together a story over a 2-month period and just keep building and adding to that. 44 Days by David Burnett.
Hold it up so we can see it. Thank you. That's the one.
It's really it's a body of work that a lot of photographers don't get the chance to produce.
I'll tell you this, I just credit where it's due. I came back to the office one day about 12 years ago, and Jacques Ménage, who's a writer and a filmmaker who's been on and off associated with Contact over the years and has done a number of things with Contact photographers, had kind of led this, let's take every picture we can find and make a 3x5 print, and they had put up this timeline around one of the rooms at the office. And I walked in and I looked at this thing, and I just thought it was the most amazing, because I didn't, like most photographers thinking about most things, I didn't think I had a book there. I thought, yeah, I've got a few good pictures and I tell some of the stories. Never would I have thought that I had a book. And when it came to be just putting up on the wall in a form that you could absorb it, you realize that there was enough for a book.
No, it's a textbook. Not only it's about the rise of Khomeini, but it's a textbook on how a photojournalist should go about approaching a long medium-term story like that. So thank you, David.
Thank you.
Really
appreciate it. Yeah.
I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Take care. Thanks.